It is wrong of you, my dear Amaryllis, to speak so amusingly of your horror of musical history. When one lives in the world of ambition and talent, with the privileges of temperament and vocal ability, it is necessary to support them with at least a minimum of the facts which only history can provide. Yes, I know you always tell me that history is boring, but I'm also ambitious and have decided, if not to amuse you, at least to guide you by giving you some elementary lessons in the history of music. That music which you now sing not at all badly, it is true, in spite of being unforgivably ignorant of history. You must know, dear Amaryllis, that in the 15th and 16th centuries music was made by cantors. No, don't flatter yourself yet. Cantors, I haven't written singers, that come later, were almost always priests or courtiers who gathered together to sing in 2, 4, or 8 parts. Princes and aristocrats maintained impressive groups of performers, which they called cappelle, which is where the phrase to sing a cappella comes from, meaning to sing together without instrumental accompaniment, even though the cappella of that period did have instruments. Some aristocrats also took part in them, like King Louis XII of France or Prince John, the firstborn son of the Catholic monarchs, and took them to travel with them, as Queen Isabella always did, even when at war. Those musical groups, amongst which were the very famous ones of the Emperor Charles V, kings of France, the Sistine Chapel, perform both sacred and secular music. The only thing that mattered to these musicians, this will seem a cliché to you, although it isn't, was music for music's sake, expression in sound, in and of itself, that is, the art of combining sounds in time. What was sung, the words, mattered very little, in spite of the poet's texts which were set, and who cared whether they were understood or not? What a joy, don't you think? How happy all you Amaryllises would be if we didn't annoy you with our endless can't understand a word you sing. I've already told you that what mattered was music for music's sake, as counterpoint, combinations, imitations of one voice by another, the constant sequences, fugues, etc., everything we understand by the word canon. Not much of what was sung was understood, not because it wasn't pronounced, but because of the nature of these compositions, which required the singers, when they sang, for example, Clarisse was combing her hair in the sun with her alabaster hand with a golden comb, to do the following. When the tenor was singing alabaster hand, the soprano was singing golden comb, and the bass joined in this nonsense, exclaiming Clarisse her hair. And not just this, many works were sung in Italian, French, and Spanish at the same time, or words were mixed up, one after the other, in different languages, even dialects. The degradation of musicians went even further in this blessed period of musical history. Masses were sung, in which one voice would intone with its particular text a popular or well-known song, which might be martial or amorous. So the tenor, for example, would utter his amorous complaint, grieving for some Amaryllis or other, they had them then too, while the other voices replied, Kyrie eleison. However, outside this music, noblest of all, purest of the pure, another way of singing was developing, the vocal solo. The first collections of this music, part vocal, part instrumental, appeared in the first years of the 16th century in Italy, followed quickly by France and Spain. The first of these books, in fact, was published in Valencia in 1535-6, and the composer was the noble Valencian Luis de Milan, a fine gentleman, an aristocratic courtier, and both a great musician and a vain Don Juan, who modestly gave himself the titles of successor to Orpheus and lady's grief. This new music lived almost entirely from borrowings. It sang popular refrains or happily lifted the most melodic parts from the great choral works. In this way, the solo voice, accompanied by the lute or vihuela in simple form, allowed what was being sung, and here is the danger for you singers, to be clearly heard. You can't imagine, Amaryllis, the success which this trick, like all tricks, had. These musicians, extraordinarily skilled instrumentalists, geniuses in fact, and excellent singers, were the spoilt children of the courts, and without anyone realizing it, they were undermining the high, proud walls behind which the imprisoned Palestrinas, Lassoses, Vittorias, and Ligrenzis were raising their sonorous spires to the heavens or creating madrigals full of audacious sounds. And you will see what happened, which will fill you with both delight and fear at the same time. But I see that reading this is beginning to tire you, so let's leave it for another letter, if you promise me that you will read it. In spite of your lively protest at my having called you totally ignorant of the history of music, your reply, which proves that you've read my letter from beginning to end, inspires me to continue with these brief history lessons, kind of trivial pursuit for a musicologist. The Renaissance brought, amongst other things, the knowledge of the Greek and Latin classics, which the Middle Ages had either not known about or had forgotten, hence its name. Their works were translated, and even their tragedies and comedies were performed, in which music, especially in the former, took such an important part that words, music, and dance formed a completely unified whole. But what could not be translated, as a result of having been largely lost, and through ignorance of the musical notation employed by the Greeks, was the music over which the actors declaimed their words. Note the word I just used, declaimed. Renaissance artists were not daunted by so small a thing, and set off along the attractive path of conjecture, borne on the wings of their imaginations. And some enthusiasts for music, men of sensitivity and artistic spirit, who gathered at the famous meetings of Count Bardi in Florence. What idiocies must have been uttered in those meetings of such special spirits! After much shouting and discussion, much joking, and clever, ironic, or ingenious phrases, agreed and declared that the most important musicians of the time, whose technique is still astonishing, were just annoying. That all those many-voiced madrigals and the magnificent works of polyphony is the art of writing for many voices, in which each must be sufficient unto itself and have its own significance within a common domain, was music that was out of date. They maintained that so many voices together just gave one a headache, and that it had no interest anymore because it didn't excite anybody. It didn't move them. Move, another word which you as a singer should take note of. And they thought that music should be written like that of the Greeks, and since no one knew what it was like, it should be invented. Down with Palestrina and that great constellation of composers of his time, unbearable old fogies who didn't know how to express emotion or how to move the listener. They themselves were going to move. As I told you, those who spoke like this and were about to act, compared to the masters they were attacking, enthusiasts, half poets, half musicians, singers, in fact, not cantors. Like David against Goliath, they marched against the fortress of polyphony, carrying no weapons except a harp, a lyre, or a lute, the latter being the preferred instrument, and those other arms which seemed so insignificant, but which were in fact frightening: the voice and declamation. The art of singing had been born. The advancing foot soldiers of that fierce musical war were the collections of madrigals for a single voice, which all those foolish composers wrote, and above all sang, These collections of new music, as the composers modestly called it, were written by Galileo, del Cavaliere, Giacomo Peri, by Caccini, the most gifted of them all. When Caccini sang, accompanying his madrigals to Amaryllis on the lute, his heavenly voice and purest diction made us shed copious tears to the point where we thought we would dissolve. To move, to declaim, to sing, here, dear Amaryllis, is what those musicians achieved who rode into view between the 16th and 17th century. But a bulwark was needed, nevertheless, from which the final assault could be made upon counterpoint, and this was opera. Based on what Greek tragedy might have been, those enthusiasts invented an artistic form in which things were acted and sung, or rather declaimed, since the music had to serve the poetry, enhance it, take it further, augment the expressive power of the words. For this reason, those musicians didn't just sing wonderfully, but developed declamation and gesture, so that every inflection of the voice was accompanied by a clear, distinct word in the purest and clearest Italian, supported by a face whose expressions underlined perfectly the meaning of the text. In this way, the voice was like a catapult, which launched the words and music as far as possible, with the deepest possible emotion. The triumph of singers was overwhelming and complete. This was the joy that had been anticipated. But the terrible thing is that they swept away and destroyed the old masters. The proud citadels of counterpoint came tumbling down, and during the first quarter of the 17th century, even during Vittoria's lifetime, the musical world turned its back on them. That music was just now in ruins. A real earthquake had shaken the foundations of music, and those audacious spirits were right. A new kind of music had been born, the opera. I'll tell you about that in my next letter.